What would you say if you knew that the world was watching you die in real time, yet no one understood what you were trying to communicate? The question hangs like a blade over the final moments of a young monk whose life had always seemed defined by serenity. On the night that everything changed, the glow of a single phone screen illuminated his face in a cramped, motionless car. The light was faint and artificial, barely enough to reveal the contours of a man who once inspired calm in millions. Inside the vehicle, the air felt thick, as if the walls themselves had tightened around him. Outside, the darkness pressed against the windows like a living force, swallowing every possible escape route. It was within that suffocating silence that the audience first noticed that something was terribly wrong. His followers had grown accustomed to his tranquil presence, to the soft cadence of his teachings, and the quiet discipline of a practitioner who lived between martial arts and mindfulness. But the man on their screens that night was not the same figure they admired. His breath trembled. His eyes darted from the rearview mirror to the shadowed corners beyond the glass. His stillness felt less like meditation and more like paralysis. He spoke only a few words, choosing the phrase, "Leave it to fate," in a voice stripped of its usual clarity. The meaning of that phrase inside a spiritual context was familiar, yet delivered in that moment, through lips that quivered with tension. It sounded less like acceptance and more like resignation. Viewers would later replay those seconds frame by frame, searching for answers in the smallest movements. Many claimed that his lips formed a brief, silent plea, a fragment of language too faint to hear, but heavy enough to cause dread when slowed down. Whatever he attempted to say was swallowed by the same darkness that enclosed the car. A few heartbeats later, the screen went black. Panic surged through the comments, but no explanation followed. Hours later, an official announcement arrived, cold and concise, informing the public that he had died in a traffic accident. The shock spread rapidly, but confusion traveled faster. The tone of the statement did not match the fear etched into his final expression. According to viewers, nothing about that live stream resembled the moments before an ordinary crash. When news reached his hometown, grief erupted in waves that tore through the quiet landscape. His family prepared the funeral in stunned disbelief, holding on to what little certainty they had. Yet certainty did not last long. During the rites, relatives discovered long and precise stitches across his body, cuts placed in areas that did not align with the injuries expected from a collision. Their sorrow shifted into horror as whispers began to form. Whispers about a violation far worse than an accident. These whispers spread through the village, then across social media, transforming into a storm of speculation. Images began to circulate, blurry but unmistakably disturbing, showing a man with an empty chest cavity under surgical lights. Claims surfaced that he had endured hours of suffering before death. None of it aligned with the official narrative, and the more people looked, the less plausible that narrative appeared. For many, this was no longer a story about an accident. It was the beginning of a labyrinth, and that is where we begin. In the days that followed his death, investigators and ordinary viewers alike returned to a single question. Who exactly was the young monk whose final broadcast had unsettled an entire nation? According to public records and interviews conducted during his rise to prominence, he was described as disciplined, introspective, and unusually charismatic. His online presence had grown gradually, built not on spectacle, but on the quiet influence of a man who understood how to speak to a restless audience. He shared lessons about balance, self-restraint, and the physical and spiritual dimensions of martial practice. Nothing in his history suggested instability or reckless behavior. If anything, his reputation painted a picture of someone who valued structure and mindfulness. The contrast between that image and the man seen during the live stream created the first major fracture in the narrative surrounding his death. The shift in his demeanor was stark. His posture, normally straight and centered, appeared rigid in a way that implied tension rather than composure. His eyes, usually steady, moved with a sense of urgency that observers later described as a search pattern. According to those who watched the broadcast live, there was no moment of calm. There was only the relentless rhythm of his breathing, amplified by the confined space of the car and the unnatural silence behind it. The car itself became a point of focus. It was not the type of environment viewers associated with him, and early analysis noted that he never explained why he was there. No road noise was audible. No headlights passed across the reflective surfaces. The absence of external sound raised questions about whether the vehicle was parked rather than in motion, a detail that seemed at odds with an official claim of an impending accident. It also contributed to a sense that he was waiting for something or someone, though that assumption was impossible to verify. What could be confirmed was the physical tension in his shoulders, the way he looked repeatedly toward the rear of the vehicle, and the silence he allowed to stretch far longer than his audience had ever heard from him. When he eventually spoke, the phrase "leave it to fate" carried a weight that his usual tone never held. Within spiritual teachings, the phrase is common, meant to suggest acceptance rather than fear. Yet the recording captured a delivery, strained enough that analysts later compared it to a final statement. His throat sounded dry, his breath trembled. The words did not resemble a lesson, they resembled preparation. Viewers who replayed the footage noted that he touched his lower lip briefly, a gesture some believed indicated hesitation. Others saw it as a signal of distress. The video itself did not offer a definitive interpretation, but it did show a man who seemed to reach the edge of his composure. The final seconds became the most scrutinized portion of the entire recording. When slowed down, the frame showed his lips forming a short, silent phrase. Because there was no audio, interpretations varied. Some insisted the shape of his mouth resembled a plea. Others believed it was simply a breath or the beginning of another sentence, cut short by the abrupt end of the live stream. What remained undisputed was the sudden transition to a black screen. There was no sound of impact, no audible reaction, and no indication that the device had recorded any physical movement. It simply ended, leaving millions of viewers staring at a void that offered no explanation. Hours later, the official statement announcing his death attributed the cause to a traffic accident. The wording was brief and lacked detail. According to the document, he had sustained fatal injuries consistent with high-impact trauma. For families accustomed to standard reporting procedures, the lack of elaboration felt unusual. Statements regarding accidents typically provide specific contexts, such as road conditions, time of impact, or locations of injury. None of these elements appeared in the announcement. This omission led many to question whether the document represented a complete account or an initial placeholder, meant to halt speculation. The atmosphere in his hometown shifted rapidly from grief to confusion. Relatives preparing the funeral made observations that intensified public scrutiny. According to family accounts, the body bore long, precise stitches in areas that did not align with the injuries described in the official report. The stitches were straight, clean, and evenly spaced, characteristics associated with surgical procedures rather than emergency trauma response. While it is common for autopsies to involve incisions, the placement of these particular cuts raised questions among those who saw them. They noted that the locations did not correspond with areas typically examined during a standard autopsy for vehicle accidents. These observations, although informal and not part of any official medical statement, became the catalyst for widespread speculation online. Images that circulated shortly afterward further fueled the uncertainty. One of them, a blurred photograph of a man lying under surgical lights with a hollow cavity where vital organs should have been, spread rapidly across anonymous forums. The authenticity of the image could not be verified, yet its impact was immediate. Viewers connected it to the claims made by the family, even though no formal identification existed. Analysts pointed out that the photograph lacked metadata, timestamps, and traceable origins. Nevertheless, the similarity between the man's build and the monk's general appearance led many to accept the connection without evidence. The conversation shifted away from the accident report and toward increasingly complex theories about what might have occurred between the end of the live stream and the appearance of his body. The combination of his uncharacteristic behavior, the abrupt cutoff of the broadcast, the minimal official statement, and the family's observations created a landscape of contradictions that demanded deeper examination. At the center of these contradictions was the question of agency. Did he have control over his environment during the live stream, or was he under some form of duress? Did the silence represent contemplation? Or did it indicate restraint? And why did the official narrative address none of the concerns raised by the footage? These questions did not produce immediate answers, but they shaped the foundation of the public investigation that followed. As the story gained momentum, viewers began to analyze every detail with the intensity of a forensic team. They built timelines, cross-referenced prior behavior, and examined the footage frame by frame. The more they examined, the stranger the gaps became. It was no longer a matter of interpreting a single event. It was the beginning of a pattern. The questions raised by his final broadcast did not fade with time. Instead, they expanded, drawing attention from every corner of the digital landscape. What began as confusion slowly hardened into suspicion. The footage, the silence, the stitches, and the conflicting accounts formed a constellation of anomalies that felt too deliberate to ignore. In the days that followed, the online world took on the atmosphere of a dimly lit archive room, where every file, every whisper, and every grainy image carried the weight of potential evidence. The monk's story no longer belonged to a single community. It had become a case, one dissected by countless anonymous investigators who operated with the intensity of professionals, but without the constraints of official procedure. As speculation intensified, the blurred photograph that had circulated anonymously took on a life of its own. Analysts who examined the image noted that the surgical table and lighting appeared to resemble a controlled medical environment. The cavity in the torso was empty, and the surrounding edges were clean, suggesting a post-mortem procedure rather than a chaotic injury. Despite these observations, no authoritative source would verify the photograph. The absence of confirmation did not slow the public. For many, the unknown origin of the picture became part of its power. It slipped through message boards like a shadow that refused to be captured, resurfacing each time a new question emerged about the inconsistencies in the official narrative. The public response grew darker. The tone of discussion shifted from concern to dread. Long threads formed, filled with timelines, overlays, and attempts to match the body in the photograph to the monk's physical proportions. Some viewers believed the match was undeniable. Others argued that the lack of validation made any conclusion premature. Still, the image was impossible to dismiss. It felt like an echo from a room no one was supposed to see. While the photograph dominated early debates, the live stream remained the central piece of the puzzle. Frame-by-frame analyses revealed details that had gone unnoticed by casual viewers. Some viewers pointed out faint reflections in the rear window that resembled movement, though no consensus emerged about what those shapes might be. Others highlighted irregularities in his breathing pattern, comparing it to stress responses documented in crisis intervention footage. These interpretations were speculative, yet they contributed to the growing unease. The sense that he was not alone in the car became one of the most persistent theories online, even though nothing in the footage explicitly confirmed the presence of another person. The uncertainty deepened when discussions turned to the official accident report. The document had been released quickly, and the lack of supplementary information became increasingly conspicuous. In most fatal collisions, authorities disclose factors such as time of impact, vehicle damage, and medical findings. None of those details accompanied the announcement of his death. Instead, the report read like a closure rather than an explanation. Investigators unaffiliated with the case began to question whether the report had been issued before a full examination had been completed. Without verifiable medical statements or forensic details, the public could only rely on unofficial accounts, and those accounts described injuries that did not align with what an accident would typically produce. This divide between the official and unofficial narratives created a vacuum, and the vacuum invited darker interpretations. Public sentiment shifted sharply. Many online analysts began to argue that the timing of the report itself was suspicious, noting that the conclusion appeared before any transparent investigation had been documented. These concerns did not prove wrongdoing, but they underscored a pattern of gaps that continued to widen. As the tension escalated, new voices joined the discourse. Individuals claiming to be acquaintances, former collaborators, or insiders within different circles offered fragmented recollections about his final weeks. None of these accounts could be confirmed, but their consistency created an unsettling picture. Several described him as unusually cautious during his last days, noting that he seemed distracted or burdened by something unspoken. According to one anonymous contributor, he had postponed several engagements shortly before his death. The reasons were unclear. The user claimed that he had appeared fatigued and withdrawn. But again, no verification existed, yet the detail echoed through online communities, reinforcing the belief that the livestream had not been an isolated moment of fear, but the culmination of a longer period of pressure. As investigators online continued to search for clarity, they began to piece together the timeline that stretched from his last public appearance to the announcement of his death. The gaps between events became as significant as the events themselves. Hours were unaccounted for. Communications that might have clarified his movements were either missing or never shared publicly. The vehicle he had been in was never shown. No location was confirmed. The silence around these logistical details created the sense that the physical world had become as obscured as the psychological one. The noir atmosphere surrounding the case intensified when discussions shifted to the environment where his body had been handled. Several commenters, reportedly from medical backgrounds, noted that the precision of the incisions described by his family resembled controlled procedures, not trauma care. They pointed out that typical accident victims show irregular tearing, bruising, and emergency intervention marks. Instead, the accounts described straight lines, symmetrical closure, and stitching characteristic of planned anatomical access. While these statements were anecdotal, they added another layer of unease. They indicated intention, not reaction. The case now occupied a liminal space between documented fact and unresolved possibility. It was a story where the grain of a photograph, the pause of a breath, and the angle of a shadow became potential evidence. The absence of answers became its own form of presence. The more people searched, the more the darkness around the case seemed to thicken, as if the truth had retreated into the recesses of a place no one was meant to explore. Yet despite the fear that permeated the investigation, one thing became clear. The inconsistencies were not random. They formed a pattern. Each unanswered question led to another anomaly, and each anomaly led the public further into a labyrinth where certainty was scarce and suspicion grew heavier with each passing day. By this point, the case had moved far beyond the boundaries of a single tragedy. It had become a mirror held up to an entire system, reflecting tensions that had existed long before the monk's final broadcasts. And as the public traced the shadows that stretched across the story, they discovered that the trail did not end with him. It was leading somewhere else, somewhere darker. As public scrutiny intensified, the case began to evolve into something far more expansive than the death of a single public figure. The anomalies surrounding the monk's final hours created a lens through which earlier tragedies were re-examined. Threads that had once seemed unrelated now appeared to align with unsettling precision. Each new discovery pulled the investigation deeper into a network of events that, according to online analysts, shared structural similarities too distinct to ignore. What emerged was the outline of a larger narrative, one that suggested the monk's death might not be an isolated incident but part of a broader pattern. The next figure to draw attention was a young actor whose passing had been reported as sudden and unresolved. His case had drawn moderate interest when it first occurred, but the official statements offered little clarity. When investigators online placed his timeline alongside that of the monk, they noticed parallels. Both men were young, rising in influence, and positioned at critical turning points in their careers. Both deaths were accompanied by swift conclusions issued by authorities, and both left behind families who privately expressed confusion at the lack of detailed information. While none of these overlaps proved a direct connection, they added texture to a growing suspicion that another life had ended, under circumstances that were never examined with transparency. As comparisons deepened, archived conversations, interviews, and images resurfaced. One photograph, taken behind the scenes during a routine production day, showed the young actor in the foreground, while a man stood behind him with crossed arms and an impassive expression. The image was not remarkable at the time of its release, but in the context of the ongoing investigation, it took on an ominous quality. Users claimed the man was a manager associated with several high-profile artists. According to online claims, this manager had been present during the final months of multiple individuals who later became subjects of controversy. Although these assertions lacked formal confirmation, the repetition of his presence raised questions about his role and influence. The actor's interviews from his final months were also re-examined. Observers noted that his demeanor seemed inconsistent across appearances. In some recordings, he appeared energetic and focused, while in others, he seemed subdued, as if weighed down by something unstated. Several users pointed to subtle gestures, such as the way he adjusted his collar or touched his jaw, interpreting them as attempts to conceal discomfort. These observations were speculative, but they contributed to the atmosphere of unease that had begun to envelop his story. In parallel, analysts revisited a third case involving a performer whose death several years earlier had generated widespread speculation. At the time, his passing had been attributed to personal struggle. Yet rumors persisted that circumstances surrounding the event were more complex. When placed alongside the monk's and the actor's stories, similarities became difficult to dismiss. In each case, the official conclusion was issued quickly, and follow-up details were scarce. Public records offered limited insight, and discrepancies between eyewitness statements and formal documentation had long fueled debate. What heightened tension further was the circulation of allegations that this third individual had shown signs of physical distress in his final public engagements. Some viewers claimed that part of his appearance suggested recent injury, though no authoritative source ever confirmed such claims. These observations created an impression of unresolved questions that echoed the uncertainties surrounding the other two cases. While coincidence could not be ruled out, the accumulating parallels shaped a narrative that no longer felt like chance. Against this backdrop, a significant figure emerged. The manager whom users had identified in the background of earlier images. His name appeared repeatedly across online discussions. According to fragmented reports and speculative threads, he had professional ties to all three individuals at different points in their careers. Some claimed he had a reputation for strict oversight. Others described him as disciplined, private, and unyielding. There was no verified evidence of misconduct, yet his proximity to each case created a sense of continuity that investigators found difficult to overlook. Digital analysts traced his public profiles, noting that his online presence was minimal, almost curated. Old posts of his resurfaced through archived screenshots. Among them were artistic compositions featuring stylized interpretations of disassembled forms. The images were abstract and did not violate any regulations, but their thematic focus drew interpretation in the tense climate surrounding the case. Some users argued that the images demonstrated a fascination with fragmented anatomy. Others insisted such readings were influenced by fear and conjecture. Still, the images fed into a narrative of unease that was becoming increasingly difficult to untangle from fact. As interest in the manager intensified, investigators began to explore his background through available records. According to online contributors, he appeared to have affiliations with groups beyond the entertainment industry. Some claimed he had prior experience in fields that required rigid discipline. None of these claims were verified, yet their persistence demonstrated how deeply the public had immersed itself in the investigation. Every detail, confirmed or not, was treated as a potential piece of evidence. Parallel to the focus on individuals, another dimension of the case emerged, an environment in which the deaths had supposedly occurred. Analysts studied connections between locations associated with the individuals, mapping out geographic and logistical patterns. In some instances, properties were linked to figures with influence across multiple sectors, including media and cultural institutions. These links were circumstantial, yet they contributed to the perception that the story extended beyond personal tragedy into systemic terrain. It was within this context that new documents were reportedly leaked online. They were not official records, but rather fragments of unverified correspondence that described private gatherings involving individuals of prominence. The documents referenced discussions about artistic projects, investments, and collaborations. Their origins were unclear, and their authenticity could not be established. Nevertheless, their tone conveyed an atmosphere of exclusivity and control, prompting users to question whether decisions about careers, opportunities, and possibly destinies were being shaped in environments shielded from public scrutiny. The emerging narrative painted a portrait of an ecosystem in which influence, secrecy, and hierarchy played central roles. The monk's final moments now appeared, in the eyes of many observers, to be the visible edge of a structure that operated beneath the surface. Whether that structure was real or the result of collective projection remained uncertain. What was clear was that the public had moved far beyond the initial question of how he had died. They were now asking why a pattern of unexplained endings had formed around individuals whose trajectories should have continued. The noir weight of the investigation thickened as the threads converged. Each piece of information, no matter how small, cast a longer shadow. Names resurfaced, dates aligned, and rumors gained contextual heft. Nothing was proven, yet nothing felt entirely dismissible. A sense of design, intentional or imagined, seemed to hover over the timeline. By the time this phase of the investigation settled, the public had reached a threshold. They believed they were no longer examining isolated tragedies. They believed they were observing the outline of a system in operation, one that existed beyond the reach of conventional visibility. And once a system is suspected, every unanswered question becomes fuel. Every silence becomes a warning. In the end, the story that began with a dim screen inside a silent car evolved into something far larger than the final moments of a single man. It became a lens that exposed the fragility of truth in an environment shaped by influence, secrecy, and competing narratives. His death, whether understood fully or not, forced a reckoning with the structures that surround public figures, whose lives unfold at the intersection of admiration and vulnerability. The lines between fact and speculation remain difficult to navigate. Yet the collective response revealed how deeply people yearned for accountability when clarity was withheld. The monk's final broadcast remained the emotional axis of the case. It captured a human being at the edge of something unknown, a moment that viewers could not forget, regardless of the theories that followed. The fear in his eyes was real, and it signaled a level of distress that no official statement ever addressed. That disconnect created a wound in public trust. Each unanswered question became a reminder that narratives shaped by authority do not always satisfy the fundamental need for truth. His death highlighted the consequences of silence from institutions that were expected to uphold transparency. The other cases revisited during the investigation added depth to that wound, whether connected or not. Their stories revealed parallel timelines, marked by abrupt conclusions, limited explanations, and families left with unresolved grief. The sense of repetition unsettled many observers. It suggested that the systems surrounding these tragedies were not built to illuminate the circumstances, but rather to close them quickly. In this pattern, the public saw not only potential oversight, but also a reflection of how easily individual stories could disappear beneath layers of official brevity. Out of this climate, a different kind of legacy emerged. The community that formed around the investigation demonstrated an unusual persistence. They examined inconsistencies, preserved records, and demanded answers, even when formal channels remained silent. Their efforts did not replace the role of professional investigators, but they revealed something important about collective vigilance in the digital era. When people feel that institutions have withdrawn, they search for alternative means to preserve accountability. It is not a perfect mechanism. It is often chaotic, yet it represents a refusal to allow unresolved tragedies to fade into obscurity. For his family, the aftermath of the case remained deeply personal. Their loss was not a symbol or a puzzle. It was the absence of a son, a sibling, and a figure who had once inspired countless strangers. The noise that surrounded his death did not diminish the quiet truth of their grief. What they sought was not spectacle, but clarity. Their search echoed the broader desire for fairness that resonated far beyond their home. As the story settled into public memory, one final lesson remained clear. When narratives fracture and shadows lengthen, the responsibility to seek truth grows heavier. The case demonstrated how uncertainty can spread when transparency is withheld, and how speculation thrives in the void left behind. It revealed, most of all, that the pursuit of justice does not always begin in courtrooms. Sometimes it begins with people who refuse to look away. The questions surrounding his death may never be answered fully, and the events that followed may never align into a single coherent account. Yet his story stands as a reminder of the importance of accountability, the value of transparency, and the duty to protect those whose voices fall silent. In a world where truth can be obscured, the determination to uncover it becomes a form of justice in itself.